One such intriguing and peculiar conflict was the surprising and dramatic French incursion into Mexico. Before diving into this unusual sequence of events, let's first explore the factors that precipitated it. In the late 1850s, Mexico was engulfed in a civil war. Liberal reformist Benito Juárez and his followers clashed with Felix Zuloaga's conservative faction, while the neighboring United States backed Juárez and his reforms. During this period, Mexico was heavily indebted to several foreign nations. As Juárez ascended to power, he suspended all debt payments for 2 years, given that Mexico had few other viable options at the time. This decision greatly displeased the European creditors who were owed money by Mexico. Thus, on October 31, 1861, representatives from Great Britain, France, and Spain convened in London to deliberate on potential responses to the Mexican government's recent decision. The ultimate outcome was a consensus that a tripartite agreement was necessary, alongside a joint intervention into Mexico to recover the funds owed to the three nations. This agreement was readily signed by all parties involved, but at the time, no one was aware that France had an ulterior motive. France, under the leadership of Napoleon III, had ambitions that extended beyond financial restitution. Napoleon was driven by a desire to expand his empire's influence, and the situation in Mexico presented an ideal pretext to explore whether Mexico could be brought under his empire's sway. However, Spain and Britain were unaware of France's broader intentions at that time. Throughout December of 1861, the European forces landed at the port of Veracruz. From there, the situation began to spiral into chaos. Initially, the plan was for the three European powers to collaborate in seizing Veracruz and compel the Mexican government into negotiations to resolve the debt crisis. The nations involved in the tripartite alliance maintained that they had no intentions of conquering Mexico or similar objectives. However, Juárez was vehemently opposed to their presence. Conversely, his conservative adversaries were somewhat receptive to the Europeans, seeing their involvement as a potential advantage in their struggle against the reformists. Nevertheless, by the beginning of 1862, it was becoming apparent to the European allies that one among them might not share the same agenda. By January, France had started to propose the idea of establishing a monarchy in Mexico, which Britain and Spain quickly rejected. At that time, it was not clear to the latter just how serious France was about this plan. Indeed, in February, the European countries confirmed their recognition of Mexico's current government, stating their presence was merely to address the issue of outstanding debts. The Convention of La Soledad was subsequently signed and ratified by the Mexican government. Negotiations commenced, but quickly unraveled by spring, as France made its intentions clear and refused to settle for anything less than its stated goals. Realizing they had been misled, Britain and Spain negotiated separate agreements with Mexico and completely withdrew their troops. In contrast, France intensified its efforts. The French had already captured several cities, including Córdoba, Orizaba, and Tehuacan, and formally declared war as they pressed onward. However, their advance was stalled at Puebla, where multiple attempts to take the city were thwarted by steadfast Mexican defenders. One of these Mexican victories, which occurred on May 5, 1862, is commemorated today as Cinco de Mayo. It honors the courageous efforts of the Mexican forces who inflicted nearly 500 casualties on the French, while suffering only about 230 casualties themselves, including those killed, wounded, or missing. French reinforcements arrived much later than anticipated, forcing the French to retreat from Orizaba to Amozoc and further back until their backup eventually arrived. With the arrival of reinforcements, the French were able to resume their advance and gradually regained the upper hand. France eventually captured Puebla and soon after took control of Mexico City as well. Ultimately, on July 10, 1863, the French achieved their objective, and a proclamation of empire was issued, officially establishing a monarchy in Mexico. In an effort to satisfy both the conservative groups in Mexico, who held strong religious beliefs, and to mend relations with the Austrian Habsburgs, with whom France had often experienced strained relations, Napoleon extended an invitation to the Austrian Archduke Maximilian to take up the position of Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian initially hesitated and was not particularly enthusiastic about the proposal. He did not align as closely with the local conservative ideals as hoped, but eventually, under pressure from France, he reluctantly accepted the offer. Across the border, the United States was discontent with the unfolding situation. Having a strong European proxy nearby undermined U.S. influence, prompting the Secretary of State to express clear disapproval. However, amidst the ongoing civil war in the United States, no further action could be taken at that time. President Lincoln was steadfast in his determination to prevent France from being drawn into the conflict on the side of the Confederacy. Fortunately for the United States, with the conclusion of the Civil War, Napoleon and Maximilian's fortunes would soon take a turn for the worse. The conservatives quickly noticed that Maximilian's political views were far too progressive for their taste. Napoleon had neglected to adequately prepare the Austrian for the challenges of his role. To the liberals, Maximilian was merely seen as a French puppet lacking trustworthiness. Moreover, public discontent was mounting in France due to the costly and seemingly futile Mexican expedition. With the Civil War over, the United States grew bolder. Despite the Secretary of State's continued disapproval without action, Generals Philip Henry Sheridan and Ulysses S. Grant took matters into their own hands. They clandestinely provided support to troops along the Texas border in Mexico. With these advantages on his side, Juarez led his forces back into direct confrontation with the French and their local allies. In the end, Napoleon understood that his ambitions in Mexico were fleeting and unattainable. On January 31, 1866, he ordered all French troops to gradually withdraw from Mexico in 3 stages over the following year. It remains uncertain whether Austria had genuinely planned to deploy troops to support their Archduke's Mexican crown in lieu of the French. However, the United States cautioned against such actions regardless. Maximilian was urged to depart Mexico and seek safety in Austria, with liberal forces advancing and the United States behind them, while France prepared to withdraw. Whether out of pride or misguided optimism, Maximilian opted to stay in his declining empire and ultimately sealed his fate. Following betrayal by one of his loyal colonels, who opened the gates at La Cruz, allowing the advancing liberal forces to enter, Maximilian was captured. Subsequently, after a ceremonial trial, the first and only emperor was sentenced to death. On June 19, 1867, the monarch and his loyal generals were ready to face execution by firing squad. Maximilian, resigned to the choice he had made and the consequences he was about to face, gave each member of the firing squad a Maximilian door before pointing to his heart and instructing them to aim well and aim directly here. His last recorded words were, "Mexicans, people of my station and background are either meant by God to be benefactors of the people or martyrs. Summoned by many among you, I arrived here for the country's well-being. Ambition did not bring me to this place. I came with the noblest intentions and heartfelt hopes for the future of my adopted homeland and for the soldiers who served under me, to whom I express my gratitude for their sacrifices in my final moments. People of Mexico, may my blood be the final sacrifice for the nation's prosperity. If more bloodshed is required, let it be shed for the country's benefit, never through betrayal. Long live independence, long live Mexico." With those parting words of hope, Maximilian and his soldiers met their fate. Soon after, Maximilian was laid to rest in Austria, marking the conclusion of the French invasion of Mexico. Despite its uncommon and often questioned nature, this short-lived intervention and establishment of the Mexican Empire as a puppet state under French influence remains a captivating and significant period in history. Among all the battles and wars in history, this one stands out as particularly captivating and intriguing.